Mr. Mankoff, thank you very much for coming to Voice of America and having the willingness to speak with us.
Oh, sure.
You just released a new report titled The Big Caucasus Between Fragmentation and Integration. Would you give us a couple of words about the general outcomes and the findings of the report and why it was decided to do it now?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the project we've been working on. I think probably the best way to think about the report is actually to look at the title and sort of expand on that. As you said, it's called Big Caucasus Between Fragmentation and Integration. So first, I mean, there's this idea of the Big Caucasus or the Greater Caucasus, which is a notion that has been percolating around CSIS, where I work for some time now. And basically what it means is that we want to look at the Caucasus region in its broader regional context. So thinking about the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus together, and then thinking jointly about their connections with neighboring powers, particularly Russia, but also Ukraine, Turkey, Iran, and the European Union and the United States as well. And as we started looking at what are the geopolitical and economic challenges that the region faces, I think the best way to conceptualize them is really this notion of fragmentation, which is to say that this is a very small region geographically, but it's broken up into a number of sovereign and sub-sovereign entities that have frequently poor relations with each other. There's very little intra-regional trade. Borders are closed across the region, and the political relationships, north and south as well as east and west, are often very difficult. And this imposes consequences on the people who are living in both the North and the South Caucasus. It inhibits their ability to interact with one another. It also impedes economic integration, which means that the development indicators in a lot of these places are much lower than they could be. And so with this report, what we're trying to do is put forward a vision of integration, which is thinking about ways of stitching together all of these different pieces of the Caucasus and specifically focusing on the role that the United States can play in bringing that about.
Well, as you mentioned already, obviously the three South Caucasian recognized states have very different political directions, or at least that's what we see for now. Georgia is leaning towards the United States or the Western part of the integration. Azerbaijan is probably more aligned with Turkey, and Armenia seems to be closer to Russia. This power play between, do you think that these are the big three players in the region, or do we have to include Iran or others who have interests and direct connection to the place?
Yeah, well, I think those are the three most important outside powers. Russia certainly is that has the historical legacy tying it to all of those countries in the South Caucasus, and the cultural and economic connections that are still there. Turkey has a historical connection as well, one that in a lot of cases goes back to the pre-Russian era, but is becoming increasingly important today as Turkey's economy grows and as the new Turkish government is seeking to play a larger regional role. And then of course the United States, simply because of its global role and its function in promoting a kind of regional balance. But if those are the three biggest powers, one of the things that's making the Caucasus a more complicated region today is the proliferation of outside actors, in addition to those three, who have interests and are playing a larger political and economic role. And these include, the countries I mentioned. It's the European Union, it's Iran, to a lesser degree it's Ukraine as well. And then there are, you can go further out as well. I mean, there's a certain role for even China. And of course Central Asia, which has its own historic connections to the Caucasus, which remain important, especially in the energy sphere.
Well, the fragmentation for various reasons, including specific conflicts, has been going on in the region for a while, and it seems like it's still happening. What are the main findings or suggestions, policy recommendations for possible integration?
Yeah, I think, you're right that in a lot of ways the fragmentation of the region is it's not new. In a lot of ways, it's a legacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Certainly the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, the fragmentation within Georgia, between Georgia and the breakaway provinces, all have their origins in the Soviet period, became major agenda items for the international community with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and are still preventing that region from knitting itself together today. That said, in a lot of ways, the situation is more dangerous today, in part because of the growth of military spending, in part because of the increasing role of outside actors. And so for that reason, I think that's why this report is particularly timely, and why one of the things we're trying to do is encourage the outside world, particularly the United States, to take an interest in promoting this vision of regional integration. Now, how do you do that? Obviously, it's a very complicated question. If there were simple answers, we'd have solved this problem a long time ago.
Sure.
You know, I think for the United States in particular, you know, the issue is political much more than it's economic. That is to say that, you know, the vision that we want to promote is one of economic cooperation and economic integration across the region. But to do that, you've got to solve all these political problems first. And there's no way that these problems are going to solve themselves on their own. You need this kind of outside attention to it, which argues for, you know, the United States and the international community more broadly playing a much larger role in addressing the root sources of some of these conflicts. Now, in order to do that, I think, you know, it's important that the United States think about itself as a kind of balancing power that's interested in working with all of the actors in the region, both, you know, the states such as Russia and Turkey, but also all of the actors within the Caucasus, both those from the de jure states and on some level the actors who represent a lot of these breakaway regions, because obviously they control territory, they have a say in what the ultimate disposition of the region is going to be, and if they're not engaged, if they're not part of the process, then I just don't see how you're going to make any progress towards solving some of this fragmentation.
Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about, say, the de facto states, do you more suggest working on the track 2 level, or do you think that there must be some kind of involvement of the existing the governments in charge?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I know there's a lot of track 2 work that's already underway involving all of these conflicts across the South Caucasus, and I think that's very important, and I think what it does is it provides a foundation for the ultimate engagement of the state level authorities. At the end of the day, though, these are political conflicts that are going to require political solutions, and that requires engagement on the political, which is to say the track 1 level. Now, you can't simply fiat that. You can't simply mandate it and have it happen. You have to prepare the groundwork, and I think that's the role of a lot of these track 2 dialogues. And I don't know what the time frame is for that becoming possible. Certainly in the United States, you know, engagement with the de facto authorities, especially in Georgia, is difficult for a variety of political reasons. And certainly in a campaign year, I don't think you're going to see any real progress towards that. But nevertheless, I think ultimately, you know, that's where this process has to go, of actually finding a way to engage the authorities on the ground across the entire region without presupposing that what you're doing is recognizing them as legitimate rulers of this territory. It's rather, you know, a focus on solving the problems on the ground, improving human security, laying a foundation for prosperity, and then kind of putting aside, to the degree that it's possible, you know, these questions about status, which kind of tend to preoccupy people in Washington when they're talking about these conflicts.
Now, some in Washington speculate that the Obama administration basically put much more attention to, in specific case of Armenia, within the region, to Armenia-Turkey aspect of it, and in a way, considering the whole restart with the Russians, they were very careful in playing in the Russia's backyard, is what they call it, right? So do you see that this politics can, if that's true, or do you agree with this? And if so or not, after this election year, depending on who comes to power, what can change on the top political level from Washington?
So on the question of, you know, the Obama administration's policy, I think, you know, this has been a very difficult issue for them because, like you said, this administration came into office making what they called the reset with Russia one of their real foreign policy priorities. And one of the major obstacles to that was the fact that the United States and Russia had long clashed over their competing roles and ambitions in the post-Soviet region, most spectacularly and most damagingly, recently at least, in 2008 in Georgia. And so I think the approach that the Obama administration took when it came into office was that they were going to make engagement with Russia a priority. They weren't going to concede to Russia anything when it comes to dealing with the South Caucasus, but they were going to make that a lower item on the agenda. They weren't going to focus so much of the attention on the bilateral relationship on that. And to a large degree, I think that was a successful outcome. I think the outcome was successful. It allowed them to make progress on a number of agenda items that were of high value for the United States, including, Iran, including on arms control, getting the new START treaty signed, and just sort of generally tamping down the pressure that had made U.S.-Russia relations complicated for a long time. So at least on the tactical level, I think that was a success. The difficulty, though, is that it doesn't actually solve the underlying problem, which is that the United States and Russia continue to have very different agendas for lack of a better term, what we can call the post-Soviet space, and that includes the South Caucasus. Mm-hmm. So at some point, again, that's going to become an issue in the relationship. And I'm not sure the extent to which the administration is prepared to have that conversation with the Russians. I think they're trying to put off as long as possible the day of reckoning. But depending on what happens within the region, that day could come, I think, sooner than people in the administration are prepared for it to come. Now, in terms of political change within this country, obviously, there will be an election coming up later this year. You've heard former Governor Romney say that he sees Russia as being the United States' #1 geopolitical competitor, which is, I think, a somewhat bizarre thing to say. But nevertheless, I think if you had a Romney administration in power, there would be a very different view of what kind of a relationship the United States should have with Russia. And I think you would probably end up with a more competitive dynamic than the one that you've had over the last 3 to 4 years. That said, the United States faces a number of challenges elsewhere in the world, from the Eurozone crisis to dealing with China to Iran to the Middle East peace process to everything else. And so, I don't think there's a lot of interest in either the Democratic or the Republican Party in sort of needlessly stirring up trouble between the United States and Russia. It's kind of a distraction from all of these other problems that the country needs to face.
Now, you mentioned the arms race that has been happening in the region for a while, and it is specifically visible in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. By not paying attention to the conflict resolution or even management and transformation makes a possibility for a violent armed conflict more higher in the region.
Yeah, I think it does. I don't believe that the governing authorities in either Baku or Yerevan actually want a resumption of conflict right now. But what you're seeing is, as Azerbaijan's economy in particular has grown, defense spending has grown at a very rapid rate. For a couple of years now, Azerbaijan's defense budget has been higher than Armenia's entire state budget. And so you're seeing a growing military disparity on the ground. And that's doing a couple of things. One, it's increasing the pressure within Azerbaijan for a military solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. You're not at the point yet. You're not at a tipping point yet where the bulk of the political class is making that argument, but it's becoming more prominent in the press and in the sort of public debate, and certainly that raises the temperature. At the same time, the influx of arms into the region means that the likelihood of some kind of a miscalculation on the ground is higher. We've seen a number of cross-border incidents, sniper shootings, and the like, and so far these haven't had broader political consequences, but the likelihood of something like that leading to unforeseen consequences becomes higher as the militarization becomes greater.
So what is the suggestion for the contribution from within the region? Forgetting about the external players for a moment, what can the sides offer to each other in order to basically promote a better ground for possible integration?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question. Again, we've had 20-some years where you've had these interactions, and I think that we're not any closer to reaching an agreement between the actors on the ground today than we have been for the last 20 years. I think at this point, it's important to focus really on the kind of ground level human security issues. pulling forces back from the border, trying to ensure against a resumption of these kind of cross-border sniper incidents, making it easier for people to travel and move across the borders and do business across the borders. Issues like that, I think, that just promote an atmosphere of trust and ultimately help create a framework when you have outside diplomatic involvement, it's going to be easier to find some kind of a broad-reaching political agreement.
Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.